Hello, peasants. How are you? I do hope you're faring well. Or, I guess I really should say, hello, peasants. It's so good to see you again. It doesn't work. So this week, I am busying myself with sewing face masks for our medical people. So this was my first prototype I made, and I'm gonna keep it for myself, and I took the time to make these ties instead of using elastic because I wanted to be more historical. So that's what I've been doing this week, and I encourage you to help your local medical personnel people and see what ways you can get involved when it comes to sewing. My Mennonite lady friends, you could put your superpower abilities to the test and produce some of these face masks. You know, not all superheroes wear capes, but some do. Only Mennonites will get there. For you Mennonites out there, my dad had an idea that with these face masks, we could use them for another purpose after the coronavirus is no longer an issue. He thought it would be a good idea to use them as prayer coverings, or how did he say, bun coverings, I think? So essentially, you would put your bun on the top of your head, and then you'd bring the straps down and tie them under your chin. I don't think it's really ever going to become a thing. I make my masks out of 5 layers of fabric and have a pipe cleaner inserted inside to act as a nose scrunchy presser thingy-mabooey-hoo. I'm not sure what they're called. Anyhow, if you want to see how I made these, to make some for yourself, and please, if you can sew, please sew them for your local healthcare providers. They really, 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 really need them. Like a lot, okay? Yes, I'm looking at you, Karen. Even you can help, okay? If you want to learn how to make these masks, I will leave a link in the description box down below for you to check out of a video taking you through the process. You know, these can also work as slingshots too, you know, if you made too many, just give them to your children, you know. It's one way to dispose of them. Also, mothers, this is a great time to teach your children, your sons, your daughters, how to carry on the beautiful tradition of learning how to sew clothes. So, think about it. Excuse me. Her name is Margot. Not Margot. I can't do this. For today's project, I will be sewing a Mennonite dress inspired by history, just like I did in the last video. Except this time, instead of using historical patterns, I'm going to be using just plain Mennonite cape dress pattern, but I will be altering it to fit in with some of the fashion plate styles from the early 1900s, mainly the Edwardian period. So for the skirt, something that I've always thought was really cool, how often it would look like one skirt panel would overlap over another one, and it would look as if that's the way the skirt fastened down the side or the back or the front. So I wanted to replicate that with this dress. While I didn't use an antique pattern, I kind of got close. I used a pattern. I looked off a pattern diagram from Francis Grimble's The Edwardian Bodice to alter the cape pattern piece to make it a lot more historically inspired. So what I mainly did was I added 5 tucks to the cape, and I had to make an allowance for that. I wanted 2 tucks running across each shoulder, and then 1 tuck down the middle that was pressed like a box pleat, and then have little rows of covered buttons running down them. So come with me and I will show you my process. of making. Yeah, let's get started. I started by altering my cape pattern piece to more accurately reflect the pattern diagram of the golfing shirtwaist in the Edwardian Bodice. I started by tracing the pattern onto craft paper so that I could save my master copy. I drew 2 lines from the shoulder seam to the waist. This marked the center of the tux. I cut along these lines and spread out my pattern using the slash and spread method. I knew I wanted my tux to be 3/4 of an inch when finished, so I had to add a 1/2 inch between the sections of the cape. Because adding the tux threw my shoulder and waistlines off, I marked a line vertically across the bust line and made sure that line matched up when I spread my pieces. Then I added 3/4 of an inch to the center front to allow for a tuck. After that, I trued up my shoulder and waist seams. Once I was finished with all this, I made a copy of my new pattern piece. Then it was time to cut out the dress. Instead of using butter knives, I opted to use these adorable sewing weights that my Aunt Lynette made for me. Aren't they simply the cutest? I started by cutting out the cape pieces and marking where the tux would go. I made the mistake of marking the stitch line of the tux instead of the center of the tux. I'll explain why this was a mistake later in the video. Then I proceeded to cut out the bodice front and back pieces and the sleeves. I hope you enjoyed that little bit of ASMR, because that is all you're getting this video. I'm sorry. When I cut out the front skirt piece, I added 2 rectangular pieces of paper to make it look like the front skirt fastens to the back skirt with tabs. This was heavily inspired by Edwardian fashion plates and patterns I've come across, as well as this lovely tab skirt Aunt Janet wears from some episodes in The Road to Avonlea. The last piece I cut out was the back skirt. I started by stay stitching on the front and back side skirt seams, pivoting my needle when I got to a corner. Here is what one side seam of the front skirt looked like when I was finished stay stitching. Next it was time for skirt dartage. I start my darts at the widest point and sew down to the narrowest point. Right before I sew off the end, I pivot my needle and take 3 stitches extremely close and parallel to the edge. Then I hand tie my knots. This ensures flat darts that won't pucker horribly. I give my darts a good pressing. I clipped the corners of the front skirt side panels up to the stay stitching line so that I could fold under the seam allowance. With right sides facing up, I lapped the front side seam over the back side seam and folded under the seam allowance of the front side seam. I saved the fabric selvage and used it as an accent, sandwiching it between the seams. The frayed edges act like piping and help the seams to pop. I top stitched the side seams together, sewing right along the fold line of the front seam. Now is a great time to tell you the name of my sewing machine. She's a Bernina, and I've always loved the name Bernadette. I'm also a huge fan of Bernadette Banner and her historical sewing creations, so I thought naming my machine Bernina was quite fitting. I think Bernadette the Bernina is quite a catchy name, don't you? I cut away the excess of the side back skirt. After that was finished, I gave the seam a good press. Pro tip: if you don't want your garments to look like they were sewn by an inexperienced sewer, press your seams after you sew them. I cannot stress that enough. After the skirt side seams were done, I pinned and stitched all my bodice and cape darts. The cape darts end up being hidden by tucks. I moved on to pinning the cape tucks into place. I matched the sewing lines of my tucks using pins so that my tucks would be even. In hindsight, this was way too time consuming, and I could have saved many minutes by marking the center of each tuck and stitching 3/4 of an inch away. This is usually how I make tucks, so I don't know why I forgot this time. Once sewn, I ironed my tucks flat and then towards the sides. This took a lot of finagling and coaxing and singing opera songs to my tucks to get them to lay flat. Just kidding. Actually, I probably was singing opera, to be honest. Or an operetta. Probably something from The Merry Widow. I ironed the center tuck flat like a box pleat and took some of the selvage fringe and pinned it underneath so that the frayed portion would stick out. I thought it would be a lovely way of bringing the waist and skirt decor together. I stitched the selvage on just underneath the tuck, so the stitching wouldn't be visible. I marked the cape hem at 1/2 inch. With right sides together, I pinned the shoulder seams of the cape, trying to match the tucks. They didn't match quite perfectly, but it ended up being close enough. I stitched the seam, then ironed it flat, and then open. After that, I turned under the cape hem along the line I had previously marked, and top stitched it down. I ironed the hem flat. This also removed the thermal pen line. With right sides together, I sewed the front and back of the bodice at the shoulder and side seams. I pressed the seams flat, then open. With right sides together, I pinned and stitched the sleeve seam. Just like I did for the cape hem, I marked up 1/2 inch and top stitched the hem, turning under along the line I drew. I ironed the hem, being careful not to put iron creases in the sleeve, since I'm not a fan of those. I decorated the sleeve using a similar method to the skirt. I cut out rectangles, stay-stitched around the edge, folded the seam allowance under, and pinched to the sleeve. I sandwiched the frayed selvage in between the applique and the sleeve. Top stitching this down was a little tricky since the sleeve was in a cylindrical shape from sewing up the arm seam. I usually decorate sleeves before assembly, but I got the idea for this after I had already sewed up the arm seam. With right sides together, I pin the sleeves into the bodice. I always start by matching the underarm seams and the shoulder seam to the top of the sleeve. Then I pin in around. These sleeves went in like a dream versus the happy little accident that happened in my last video. I used a pressing ham to get into the sleeve hole to press the armhole seam towards the bodice. I press the seam that direction because my sister despises having any fullness in her sleeves, and this helps the sleeve to be as flat as possible along the arm cap. With right side to wrong side, I pinned the cape to the bodice around the neck and sewed the seam. Fun little fact, the mannequin I'm using was my great-grandmother Ruth Ratty's mannequin that she used when she sewed her dresses back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. I clipped notches into the neck around the curve to help the neck lie flat. Then, pushing the seam towards the bodice layer, I edge-stitched the seam. In this instance, the bodice acts as a facing to the cape, and you don't want it to be visible around the neckline. I gave this a good press after edge stitching. Before I could sew the bodice to the skirt, I pinned up the back of the cape and bodice and across the waist, securing the loose ends. Then I basted both layers together. With right sides together, I stitched the bodice to the skirt. I start by locating and pinning the center front side seams and back seams, and then pin the rest. I ironed the waist seam towards the bodice, but it wanted to keep flipping down towards the skirt because of the bulk. So I had to get some waxed thread and catch stitch the seam to the bodice layer. I marked the zipper placement along the center back seam. Then, following the zipper's packaging instructions, I ironed it flat. Using a zipper foot, I secured it down. For this project, I used a 22-inch invisible zipper. Nowadays, invisible zippers are the most common type of dress closure that is found in Mennonite dresses. Sewing from the bottom to the top of the back skirt, I secured it down using my normal presser foot and then exchanged it for my zipper foot once I got near the bottom of the zipper to ensure lining up my stitch lines. This eliminated my chance of getting a pucker where the zipper joins the skirt seam. After ironing the zipper and the back skirt seam, it was time to move on to decorating the dress. I chose to accent this dress with covered buttons, 22 of them to be exact. 12 3/4 inch buttons for the skirt tabs, 4 7/16 of an inch buttons for the sleeve tabs, and 6 buttons down the front of the cape. I forget what measurements those buttons were, but they were a little larger than 7/16 of an inch. During this process, I figured out that a rubber mallet makes setting in the buttons way faster. My sleeve buttons were half ball cover buttons, and I really struggled with securing the backings on these. Do you have any tips for that? If so, please leave a comment. I tried to get Hazel to give her greetings, but she was not inclined to acknowledge the peasantry. And voila! 22 covered buttons in no time flat. After assembling all the buttons, I laid them out to check the placement, and then secured them down. To finish the dress, I whip-stitched my logo onto the back near the zipper. I got these awesome little tags recently from Amazon, and it makes me so happy to be able to sew my name on a finished garment. My social media name is Edwardian Taylor, but my real name is Richard Taylor Herr. In the past, I did have someone think that my real name was Edwardian Taylor, which would be so cool, but alas, my parents were not inclined to name me after a time period. At least I got a pun out of my name anyway. I was disappointed to find that during the construction of the dress, the fabric was prone to fraying. I didn't find this until a ways into the project. I could not find my pinking shears, and the hems were stitched way too close to be serged. So I whip-stitched the skirt, cape, and sleeve hems, and I will pink the seams themselves if they are induced into much frayage after several washings. And frayage is a word because I want it to be. Go again.
Okay.
Yes, because then you could see my eye color this way, you know? I have hazel eyes. I've said that for years. A lot of people think I have brown, but no. Look in the light. They are green and brown.